70 Gazans just left for Europe while the IDF cranks up the heat inside Gaza. Wait, did you hear what I said? 70 Gazans left Gaza? They went through Israel, and Israel allowed them to fly out of there and go move somewhere else, permanently relocate to Europe. Now, these were Gazans who had uh, dual citizenship already, so they could get started easily in a new life. But still, it's a start. And you know what's interesting is that it seems like President Trump's uh, crazy idea of flattening Gaza, moving all the Gazans out, and rebuilding it now is starting to get some traction. The plan that's been floated by Egypt does not necessarily include making all the Gazans leave and go somewhere else, but it does lay out a plan for rebuilding Gaza. President Trump came out in support of that, if that's the way they want to do it. And so that's good today. So this is your condensed update for what's going on today, March 19th, 2025, with the war in Israel. And we're going to talk in a little bit at the very end about that phone call between President Trump and President Putin. So the war in Israel, again, 70 Gazans leaving for Europe. That's a pretty exciting thing right there. The Israeli government is saying that they're going to ramp up the fighting inside Gaza. They're starting to send troops back in there now. There are IDF troops now moving it back into the Netzarim corridor or along that center part of Israel and into the Philadelphia corridor and the southern part of Gaza. And they're probably going to just go toward each other and do some sort of pincher movement to try to weed out the remaining Hamas fighters and hopefully find some hostages. Now, there were huge protests inside Israel today. They shut down the streets in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem. They went out and camped out in the streets. And like I said on the live, folks, if what you're doing is assisting your enemy in accomplishing their objectives, then whatever your intentions are, your actions probably are not good. You should probably think a little harder about your actions. And in this case, look, if Israelis are upset because Israel is going back to fighting and there's still like 24 living hostages that have yet to be released, and they know that this is likely going to result in the deaths of at least some of those remaining living hostages, there are a lot of people who just from a soft-hearted perspective are going to be very much against that. And they're going to be like, no, we should do whatever it takes to get our hostages back, even if that means capitulating to Hamas and letting Hamas run Gaza, which means losing the war, right? And so obviously that's something about which intelligent people can argue, can have discussions about. But if you are against what the government of Israel is currently doing and you want to protest, you have every right to do so. Freedom of speech in Israel. But you should not be able to do it in the middle of the street. Because if you go out and stand in the middle of the street and stop traffic, you are stopping people from being able to get to work so that they can feed their families. You are literally stealing money out of their pocketbooks. You are potentially putting people's lives at risk who cannot get to the hospital or to doctor's appointments. People are having babies on the side of the road. That is called kidnapping. And it should be treated as such by the Israeli government. That's my big point today, is that if you want to protest, fine, march up and down the sidewalk all you want, wave your signs, blare your bullhorns, whatever you want to do, but you should not be allowed to stop traffic. And indeed, after a few hours, the police moved in and broke it up and arrested a few people, but not many. The real question is, are people being paid to go in and protest? Now, I spoke with a man who lives near the home of Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem. And he has had to deal with these protesters on a daily basis since October 7th. And he says that, yes, some of these people are being paid by outside entities to come and cause division and dissension inside Israel. The one thing we know for sure is that the leadership of some of these protests were under the Biden administration connected to the White House directly through a WhatsApp group. And there were times when the Biden administration contacted these protest leaders and asked them to ramp up the protests inside Israel. That is interfering with a foreign government. That is essentially an act of war by the Biden administration against Israel, and it should be treated very, very seriously. Now, so these people who want Israel to just capitulate, I want to call them the pro-Hamas crowd. They would probably bristle at that and say, we're not pro-Hamas, we're just pro-hostage. Well, if you're trying to, if the way that you're arguing that the government is doing something wrong is by supporting the enemies of your government, that is Hamas, then you are acting in support of a terrorist organization and you should be prosecuted as such. Now, in the meantime, Benjamin Netanyahu gave a speech just a little while ago and said that he expects that the war is going to ramp up and become much more intense in Judea and Samaria and the Hebron. So those West Bank areas have already been a hotbed of extremist activity. They've had IDF troops in there and border police in there taking out bad guys since the beginning of the war. But there's apparently a lot more to be done in there. And so what Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying is no matter how long it takes us to completely destroy Hamas in Gaza, we are still going to have to turn our attention to Judea and Samaria and work in there as well. So this is going to be a long process, Okay, so just to move over to what happened in the war with Ukraine, I just want to address this because many in the media were reporting last night that there was a ceasefire deal agreed upon by President Trump and President Putin, which is interesting because President Trump is the leader of the United States. The United States is not at war with Russia directly. They're not shooting missiles and rockets and drones at Russia. And so even if they did have an agreement between Putin and Trump, Zelensky was completely left out of that. And so Zelensky had agreed in principle on negotiating a ceasefire, but one of their hard red lines was we have to be at the table. And they weren't at the table on this phone call. Now, President Trump's people put out after the call that they had a ceasefire agreement had been made. Well, that was not what President Putin's version of events was. In the readout from the Kremlin, it says that President Putin agreed to talk about a potential ceasefire on energy infrastructure only. And President Trump said it was about energy and infrastructure, not energy infrastructure. You see the very slight difference there? Energy infrastructure means power plants and refineries. Energy and infrastructure means power plants, refineries, and bridges, roads, hospitals, schools, other important infrastructure items. And there seems to be a major disagreement there. Well, as it turns out, no matter what the president thought they agreed to, President Putin went ahead and authorized strikes against Ukraine last night, and they did strike at energy infrastructure during those strikes. In retaliation, Ukraine struck back at energy infrastructure inside Russia. So there is no ceasefire. There may be at some point, but right now, the only thing that the Putin government has agreed to do is look at thinking about, talking about potentially signing a memorandum of understanding that may lead to the talking about or discussions on the potential for a maybe possible, might be ceasefire at some point as long as Ukraine loses. That's essentially what Russia is doing. They are playing games with President Trump. They left him on hold. It's been reported he was on hold for an hour waiting for President Putin, and President Putin joked about it like it was no big deal. Well, listen, if you leave the leader of the free world on hold for an hour, there should be some repercussions for that. That's all I got to say about that. All right, folks, that's a quick rundown of what's going on today. If you want to watch and hear more of my commentary on that, you can go over and watch the full live, which is already up. And we'll see you again next time.